Introduction to Human Resources Management, Chapter 2, Trends in HR Management. Something to consider when you're looking at HR is the change in the labor force. These are things that are happening because of population change, societal changes, etc. HR looks at two sources of labor. One is the internal labor source. This is basically everybody that already works for you, the employees and the people who have contracts or have agreements to work for the company. The internal labor force typically has been taken from the external job market. The external labor market is anybody who's actively seeking employment. Again, this can be people that are entering the job market for the first time, recent college graduates, high school graduates. It also could be anybody who's currently employed or has lost their job and is looking for a new position. Things to consider regarding the change in the labor force. The big issues are aging in the workforce, more diversity in the workforce, and potentially skill deficiencies for employees. You may not be able to find the people that have the requirements and the skills necessary to be able to complete the job. As far as aging in the workforce, today's workforce, unlike in the past, typically brings together as many as 4 or 5 different generations that could work. Historically, it was not that uncommon for people to work at one job and stay there for decades, potentially. You could have one main job for 20, 30, 40 years and then retire from there and never go anywhere else. The other thing is life expectancy has changed over the time. About 100 years ago, life expectancy was approximately 62, 63 years. People would retire in the 1930s for Social Security. You had to be 65 to be eligible. The fact of the matter is, back in those days, the average person's life expectancy was shorter than the eligibility requirement for Social Security. So most people lived to be 61 or 2, and you had to be 65 to retire. Now the life expectancy in the United States is approaching 80. In some places, it's even higher. Because of that, you may be working out of high school or out of college and work into your 60s or 70s. You may have multiple different generations of people that you're working with. Some of the generations that people are aware of, number one is the baby boomers. These are people that are born between 1946 and 1964. It's called the baby boom because there was a huge influx or an increase in the birth rate from people, typically those who came back from World War II. The United States involvement in World War II was between 1941 and 1945. Starting in 1946, you have millions of people that had been in service that have now come back. They had a lot of benefit plans, the GI Bill, they could go to college. They had the ability to buy houses. So you had a more educated population, and they had some level of stability that hadn't been available before to the population. So a lot of these people came back and they started families and they had a lot of babies. And the baby boomer generation was the largest cohort at that time in the history of the country. Subsequent generations, because of average population growth over time, numerically there may be more, but as a percentage of the population, the baby boom kind of set the record for youth in America. Generation X was the following generation. These are people that were born between 1965 and roughly 1980. Following them are the millennials. These are people born between 81 to roughly 1995. You have Generation Z, which are people that are now entering the workforce. They're born between 1996 and around 2012. Basically, if you have all of these different people with different reference points for growing up and things that they can relate to, you could have baby boomers working with Generation Z who grew up in entirely different worlds. Baby boomers did not have the internet. They did not have cell phones. They did not have computers when they started their careers. Generation Z has no knowledge of what it would have been like to live in that type of a society. So you can have some potential conflict or some misunderstanding simply because people had different experiences when they were growing up. All of them work together at the same place, and it's important for managers and HR staff to be cognizant of these differences. In order to maintain a population, people have to produce at least 2.1 people per couple. So if you have a married couple, if they have on average 2.1 children, that will be enough to replace them after they die, and the population will maintain its status. If you have a higher rate than 2.1, then your population will be growing. If it's lower, then you have the risk of your population decreasing. Most countries with advanced economies tend to have lower birth rates. It becomes more expensive to have babies, and it's also not necessarily a need. In the United States, 150 years ago, people had 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 children. A lot of them would then enter the labor force when they were 12 or 13 years old. They would contribute to the financial well-being of the family. It also is a lot less expensive back in those days. As the economy advances, things become more expensive, education gets more expensive, housing becomes more expensive. People tend to have fewer children as a result. In the United States, the native-born population has a replacement birth rate that is below 2.1. The reason that the United States has had growth is largely due to immigration, and certain groups do have higher reproduction rates than others. But the United States has had a growing population largely due to an influx of immigration. However, that being said, the general population, the average age, is increasing. The workers aged 55 and older are the fastest growing group in the workforce, while the numbers of those between 16 and 24 are decreasing, and that is directly related to the decline in the birth rate. For HRM, there's a lot of people that would be on the verge of retirement. You need to be aware of that and help them plan for retirement, but you also need to plan to deal with people after they retire so that you can replace them in the workforce. Older workers may age out of their position. They may be specialists in a job title that doesn't really work anymore. It's obsolete. Maybe they're in manufacturing and it's a product that isn't being made anymore. Some older workers that wish to remain in the workforce may need to be retrained into new skills and get new knowledge that would allow them to have positions. Older workers may also have plateaued in their career. They don't have any opportunities for advancement. So that is something that HR needs to consider because you want to keep motivation high. You want to maintain satisfaction so that you can retain the workers that you had, as we mentioned in Chapter 1. Healthcare continues to rise in terms of its share of costs, usually at a rate higher than that of inflation. So HR, because they have to provide benefits, the United States is relatively unique among first world countries, so to speak, these advanced economies. They do not have national health care. So a lot of employers are the ones that have to have the contracts with health plans to be able to provide health insurance for their employees. Because those costs are increasing, it does bite into the benefits. And HR has to manage a way to maintain competitiveness so that they can have benefits that they can extend to attract workers while not having an expense so high that it eats into the profits to an unsustainable rate. The other thing that HR needs to look at is because the workforce is getting older and the employees tend to be retiring more frequently, we have to be able to attract and retain younger workers as well to be able to replace those who are aging out. The next slide has a graph that just shows the change between 2021 and what is projected to be for 2031 in terms of the age distribution of the age force. In 2021, the group that is the kind of the prime time for worker productivity between 25 and 54, that was approximately 64% of the workforce. It's not that much different in 2031, but if you look at the periphery, the 55 and older group did get bigger, and the 16 to 24-year-old group, which is the one that is eventually going to be moving into that prime time age group, they are smaller. So you have older people that is increasing in size, and the younger population is decreasing in size. So over time, that is going to have an impact on businesses because they need to have enough employees to be able to do the work that has been assigned. Aside from aging, the workforce is also becoming more diverse. Because the United States has had increases in population, and a lot of that is due to immigration, growing diversity in race, ethnicity, and in gender. Historically, females have had lower pay, and they had not historically been part of the workforce to the same level as males. Women are entering the workforce more frequently than they had historically in the past. Currently in college, most colleges do have higher populations of females than males, and because a lot of the jobs in the higher end industries are going to require college education, you will have more women working than you had historically in the past. The fastest growing racial group in the United States are those who consider themselves to be multiracial, and the fastest insular ethnic group that is growing is Hispanic. Immigration is an important source of growing diversity, and as I said, the reason that the population of the United States has been able to still grow is largely due to immigration. HR needs to understand that there is a supply and demand of labor. If you don't have enough people to fill your positions, just like any other thing in business with supply and demand where it's a consideration, if you have a lower supply and the demand stays the same or is increased, that makes things more expensive. So if you have fewer people to be able to choose from, you may have to pay more money to get those with limited skill sets that are hard to find. You also need to comply with various laws that apply to diversity and discrimination. There are laws that require equal opportunity for people from different races, ethnicities. You also have to comply with laws that are designed to prevent discrimination against people who are older. There's a federal law that we will talk about shortly that provides protections for employees who are over the age of 40, for example, because that tends to be the threshold for when people start to notice that they can be experiencing some discrimination in the workforce due to their age. Because we have a more diverse workforce, HR employees should really look at certain things that are going to be priorities in order to fulfill the objective of keeping the organization staffed sufficiently. It shouldn't matter what someone's background is. You want to be able to use the talent, skills, and values and abilities of everybody that works for you. The staffing selection that you do when you hire people, you cannot use biased information. You cannot use biased opinions. You should not have tests that could be potentially biased. That would be potentially putting you at odds with current state and federal regulations and statutes that require fairness in hiring procedures. Diversity doesn't just extend to people on the basis of race and religion and others. It also can be diversity of family types. We have now experienced something known as the sandwich generation. You could have people who have children of their own and their parents are getting older, and they end up being caretakers for both the younger generation and for the older generation. Not only do they have to take care of two generations in addition to themselves, but they also have to work, and that can make things very stressful for people. So companies that are able to provide some flexibility in terms of work hours, whether you can have remote work, whether you can come in early and leave early, come in later and leave later, have time off to be able to satisfy all of the demands on the employees, that can be something that can give you a competitive advantage as an employer. Because there is more diversity in the workforce, people tend to have some issues. There could be some disputes that are based on not understanding different cultures and different backgrounds. So to whatever level that people can implement training to get people to understand the differences in cultures, the differences, specifically this is important for companies that operate in multiple countries with different cultures that they have to address. The more knowledge people have, the less likely there will be to have conflict because they'll have more levels of understanding. Companies are also encouraged to have career development for minorities and women to ensure that they are not being passed over for illegal reasons, for reasons of bias. And if you can provide the flexibility and time, that's also good. But if you have programs that could also maybe provide daycare for people that have children or elder care for people that have older parents or potentially both, that can also help satisfy the needs of your employees and get them to focus on the job more than any other things from the outside world that could be distracting and taking away from their ability to perform. The next slide shows the projected racial ethnic makeup of the U.S. workforce as projected for 2031. Historically, the United States has been a white population, which is typically defined as people from European descent. It was not unusual 20, 30 years ago for that number to be well over 80%. Right now, it is about 75%, or it's expected to be 75% by 2031. Black population in the United States is expected to be about 13%, and other groups, Asian, Hispanic, Latino, that's about 12%. The white population is still a majority, but it is expected by roughly 2050 that the United States will be a minority-majority population. A minority is simply someone who belongs to a group that is less than the majority, which is less than 50%. 50.1%, if you belong to that group, you are in the majority. Technically, right now, any minority group is any group that can be assigned by demographic terms as less than 50%. Current births, as tracked by the Social Security Administration, has indicated that the white population is having fewer births, or fewer than 50% of births, which would indicate that by the time the next generation ages out, the United States will have less than 50% of a white majority. So you would have no majority population. There would still be a plurality. They would still have the largest population group, but the country as a whole would be far more diverse than it currently is and will be in the next 10 or so years. The next slide just gives you, it's kind of this little lollipop system here where each bubble has a different category. Things that you would be doing that could support diversity management. There could be corporate strategy. You could employ things in recruitment and hiring, recruitment and selection, compensation and benefits, et cetera. So I'm not going to go through every element of this, but please make sure you take a look at the graph in your PowerPoint and read through it in the book. Skill deficiencies in the workforce are things that come up because a lot of people who go to college can pick whatever they want to do, and that does not necessarily line up with the needs that are presenting themselves to the labor market. Physical strength and mastery of machinery, endurance, that's not as important as it was 100 or 150 years ago. Most of the United States workforce is in the service industry. Now, there could be some manual labor that would still require that, but by and large, a lot of the jobs that are being produced in the United States today do require you to have mathematical skills, verbal and communication skills, interpersonal skills, being able to deal with other people in a non-confrontational way that would be professional and productive, being able to make decisions, being able to access and use computers and technology. All of these things are important and may not necessarily be provided as an education to people when they enter the workforce. A lot of companies actually have to do training to get people up to speed, even those who are college graduates, because they don't have the skills that are necessary to succeed in the jobs that are available. Ideally, HR wants to create a social system, the people that work there and how they interact, and the technical system, which is the equipment and all the policies and processes that are in place. If these work in harmony, you will be a more efficient organization and therefore more productive. 3 trends currently in high-performance work systems: reliance on knowledge workers, people who know a particular field and know it very well; empowerment of employees to make decisions. That allows creativity. It also keeps people motivated. If you work for a job where your boss tells you every single thing that you need to do and you have no discretion, that can be a pretty boring and actually kind of a stressful job. If you are allowed to make decisions, if you're allowed to have input, that type of empowerment can be motivating and can lead to job satisfaction and greater productivity as well. A lot of companies also use teamwork. Teamwork has been kind of a big deal over the last 20 to 30 years. The idea behind teamwork is that when you have a group of people working together, if they know their role correctly and they're working in a seamless, well-designed manner, they can produce more work output than any individual could if you measured it. So if you had 5 people, you could measure their outputs, but if you put them together in a team, they may produce what 5 or 6 individuals could, or 6 or 7. Ideally, that's the idea behind teamwork. You can get more out of the people that are working than you could on an individual basis. The principle behind teamwork is the old phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. You can get more out of a well-coordinated team than you could out of any individual. And companies can see that as a way to increase efficiency. So a well-managed team is a good way to be able to increase productivity. It should be noted, however, that a lot of companies embrace teamwork, but they don't do a good job of training people about how to be on a team. Well-managed teams can get that benefit where you can have more productivity than you could from individuals. But if you have a poorly managed team where people don't understand their roles, they don't know who's making the decisions, you could actually decrease the amount of output. So you could have 5 people working on a team that fall into dispute. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know what is expected of them. They may produce the same as 4 or 3 individuals as opposed to 6 or 7. So the key is to have teamwork, but it's also to have well-managed teams so that people understand their roles and there's no ambiguity about what they're trying to accomplish. The next slide just highlights some of the occupations that are growing in terms of job growth. New jobs on the left and the fastest rate of growth is on the right. So the most new jobs in terms of the raw numbers, healthcare, personal care aides, restaurant cooks, those have the most numbers, but for the rate of increase, that would be in the right-hand column. So like nurse practitioners, wind turbine service technicians, that has one of the fastest rates of growth because wind turbines are relatively new. From raw numbers, there aren't that many, but because it's a new technology and it's growing at a faster rate, there may be more available positions in those fields. So the column on the left are jobs that are growing in terms of real numbers or raw numbers. The jobs on the right are the fastest rates of growth. We mentioned the growth of knowledge workers. Their idea is that if you have people who understand how things work, they can better serve their customers. They understand processes. They understand professions. They are able to make decisions a little bit more on their own because they have the knowledge and the capabilities to do it. And if you don't have to ask your boss for permission or how to make a decision, that makes the processes more efficient because people who have high levels of knowledge can work more efficiently. They don't have to have time to go and ask other people how to do something they already know. Knowledge workers are also typically people in a position of power. If you have a lot of knowledge, you can explain to the people that are reporting to you. And also, this is very competitive. So if you have a job with a fast rate of growth, like we talked about in the previous slide, a lot of them are filled by knowledge workers. If you understand how to do the things in the cutting edge jobs, you will have access to jobs that other people may not be able to. If you're in a hiring position for these types of fields, you need to understand where to look to find those people that have the type of knowledge that are going to be commensurate with the jobs that you're searching to fill. While knowledge workers tend to be people who are at the higher end of the pay scale and maybe have more responsibility, there is an argument that all workers are knowledge workers. And if you can increase the knowledge for anybody at any level, that will also increase efficiency and productivity throughout the organization. One way to have a high-performance work system is to ensure that you have training. We will have a chapter on training, so I'll go into that more. Upskilling is a term that has come out over the last few years, where you get employees and you train them to improve and expand their current skill set. That's basically what training does. You have them in their current job, you want to make them better at what they do. So you can either give them the introductory information that they need to know to be able to do the job when they get hired, but you can also give them training to be able to step up and do more in their current job. Reskilling is when you may have a new knowledge or a new capability that is required for the job. Because of the speed of technological growth, a lot of jobs are changing because a lot of them are dependent upon the technology that is available. There is something called Moore's Law. Moore was named after a person named Moore who worked for a computer company, and he basically said that the number of transistors that you can fit on a computer chip will increase by double every 18 months to 24 months. So basically every year and a half to 2 years, computing power will double. This has held remarkably true for the last 40 or 50 years or so. When you look at the NASA projects that put people on the moon, the computer that was used for the Apollo 11 mission was less powerful than the computer capabilities that you have in your pocket, because your cell phone has far greater capabilities than the largest and most sophisticated computers from 50 years ago. That is because of Moore's law. That also means that things are changing very quickly. And because the equipment that people use to do their jobs is changing, also the skills that they need to be able to use that computer also changes. So reskilling kind of helps you keep up with the speed of change and the rate of change in the job market. We mentioned employee empowerment in Chapter 1. Providing people with the opportunity to have input is a big deal for motivation and keeping them satisfied. If you allow employees to make more decisions, they will also share in losses and rewards, so it could be related to incentive pay that we'll talk about in the future. It can lead to more innovation and sharing of ideas. If you have a company that is willing to listen to their employees, the employees are the ones who are doing the work. If you can get information from them about how to improve what they do, they're probably the experts more than their managers or their supervisors would be. Delegating decision-making authority to your staff is one way to be able to give them empowerment. Now, that doesn't mean that you want to give a low-level person the authority to buy $1 million worth of equipment. When you delegate authority, you should be very specific about what you are delegating to them. If you have to buy equipment, maybe you give them a $500 cap, and anything above that they have to ask permission for. Anything below that, provided that you've given them the training and an understanding of how to do it correctly, that can cut out a lot of wasted time getting approvals for other things. So empowerment works both ways. It can keep the employees happy, but it can also improve efficiency for the company. HRM practices and performance management training work design, all of these things, including compensation, should be considered and reviewed frequently because, as I said, while technology is changing the workforce, job descriptions, other aspects of the jobs are changing. HR needs to stay abreast of that as well, so they need to constantly update all of their policies and procedures. Keeping employees engaged is also tied to empowerment. If you ask them questions, if you get their feedback, you can respond to issues before they really turn into problems. It can lead to higher productivity. And if customers are happy, it's usually because the employees that you're dealing with are also happy on the job. And it can decrease turnover, which will also reduce expense. You can also shift recruiting focus away from technical skills and towards more cognitive and interpersonal skills. If you hire people that have the technical skills that they're supposed to have to be able to complete the job, then you can just trust that they will do the job and then allow them to work with others and come up with new innovative ideas. So you don't necessarily need to focus on the job itself. If you give them the training and they have the capability to do it, you can then give them a little bit more free rein to be able to make decisions on their own. I already mentioned teamwork a little bit. If you have teamwork, it can increase responsibility and control. You have virtual teams that give you the authority or the opportunity to use things like Zoom and WebEx and Teams, Microsoft Teams, to allow people from various geographic locations to work together. If you only had one location in Boston and you only had the people that were working in Boston, then you are limited in the amount of input and suggestions that you can get from people for innovation. If you have the ability to meet with people from a company that has people in San Francisco or overseas in Europe or in Asia, you can still meet and have these people working together and bringing in input from other places. It's almost always better to make a decision and come up with a solution when you have really diverse information coming in various backgrounds. If you have 5 people that have the same background, they're going to be very limited in the ideas that they can come up with new ideas or solutions to problems. If you have 5 people from completely different backgrounds, they're going to be looking at a lot of different experiences, a lot of different educations. They're going to have different contexts from which they can base their ideas. And you can merge all of those together and come up with a more vibrant process to create solutions and new processes for businesses. Teamwork can motivate employees by giving them the opportunity to work closely with others and to be exposed to these different ideas. And it allows you to really put everything together so that the organization's strategies and activities can benefit from all of this additional information. The caveat that I gave before holds true here, though, because if you're going to be using teamwork, you should be focusing on letting people understand what the nature of a team is. Who's the manager of the team? Who gets to make the decisions? Is it a work team that's only on its own? They're self-governing. They can make their own decisions. What is the goal of the team? Is it to come up with new ideas? Is it to complete a process? Is it to do work? Making sure that people understand their roles on the team will ensure that the team itself is going to be more productive. If you have a badly managed team, it's not going to be productive. And as I noted before, you may have less productivity than you would if they were working as individuals. From a strategy perspective, the company's strategy is going to be set up and established by the senior management. HR has to help work with them to be able to support the strategy and ensure that it gets passed through all of the supervisors and managers, and it's reflected in the processes and policies of HR so that all the employees know what to expect and what is required for them in terms of performance. You want to make sure that all of the policies and practices are aligned so that there is no conflict. And if you can have quality improvement programs, if you have mergers and acquisitions, restructuring, HR plays a huge role in all of that. Mergers and acquisitions. A merger is when two companies join together to come and create a brand new company that didn't exist before. Whereas an acquisition is usually a larger company purchases a smaller company and brings them aboard. So you don't create a new company. The other company is going to have to fit into the new culture of the company that is acquiring them. Whereas a merger is more complicated because you're going to have to establish a new corporate culture, new policies. Why do companies do mergers and acquisitions? It's basically to get access to more consumers. You want more customers. The bigger your customer base, the more money you can make. And if you've got company A, which is 20% of the market, and company B, which is 10% of the market, if they either go through a merger or an acquisition from one or the other, you will now have 30% of the market. But because you are now one company instead of two, you don't need to have two CEOs, you don't need to have two HR directors, you don't need to have two marketing directors. So you can increase efficiency through mergers and acquisitions by expanding your customer base, but eliminating redundancies within the organization. That can increase the productivity and efficiency of the company and therefore profits at the end of the day by increasing your customer base while being able to cut back on the administrative expense that the company has to support. The next slide I've already kind of talked over because we went through mergers and acquisitions. HR does get involved quite a bit in that. If it's a merger, they're going to be dealing with the new ethics. They're going to be dealing with how the new processes are going to work. If it's an acquisition, you need to make sure that the new employees coming from the company that was acquired understand what these different policies are, the policies from the company that was acquiring them that will be applied to them. HR will then be involved in conflict resolution, differences in practices, and being able to smooth everything out. It's not unusual for companies that go through mergers and acquisitions to spend several years perfecting the new policies and processes that have to be put in place. TQM stands for Total Quality Management. This is something that came largely from Asian businesses, largely also Japanese businesses, Motorola, Toyota. A lot of those companies really embraced total quality management. What that does is it does rely on employee empowerment, because if you want to improve your services or your products, it's really the employees that are making those products or providing those services that are the expert. Total quality management pushes down to those employees to make them responsible to ensure that the products and services that they are providing and producing are at a high level of quality. That requires employees to understand what it is, so they have to be trained in it. You can design quality into a product or service so that errors are prevented from occurring, and you can increase the level of quality by embracing what the input is from these employees, because you are empowering them to make suggestions to improve the process all around. Total quality management extends to vendors and suppliers and the processes that you use to contract to get resources in so that you can do your manufacturing or buy new equipment. Managers also look at the feedback that they get from that type of data to ensure that the quality is increasing over time. So you have to track all of the performance that you're doing, and it's up to the managers through performance management criteria to assess whether or not you are actually achieving the goals that you've set out. Cost control is important for HR. Typically, the largest expense for a company is the employees, the salaries and the benefits that they have to pay a lot of the amount of expense the company experiences. Some companies do have a low-cost, low-price strategy. If you're Walmart, you're not probably going to be hiring the greatest people in the world to work at Walmart. These are usually low-paid jobs. Some companies, like Costco, they pay their people more. They provide benefits because they believe that if you have a higher level of employee, they will do a better job. You'll get a bigger bang for the buck. You'll be paying them more, but they'll be more productive, and they're increasing productivity by giving them the training and giving them this more education, giving them higher rates of pay and better benefits. That will result in higher levels of productivity that will offset any savings that you might make by having a low-cost plan. So one is not necessarily better than the other. It depends on what your strategy is. It depends on what your ultimate mission is. If you are a low-cost, low-price strategy, then HR will reflect that, and you will be hiring people that typically make less money. If you have a higher cost, higher price strategy, you may be spending more money on your employees, and that can be still a valid way to do it because you can get a better return for it if you manage it correctly. The challenge is always to be able to lower costs without really compromising in quality. Again, you get what you pay for. Sometimes that's not necessarily true. A lot of times, if you go out to a liquor store and you have to buy a bottle of wine for a dinner that you're going to, you could spend a lot of money on wine. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a better bottle of wine. You could buy a $10 bottle of wine that may taste better than a $50 bottle of wine. I don't know anything about wine, so I'm not the person to ask about that. But typically, if you do have someone with a higher level of experience, they are going to demand more pay because they are going to be fewer in supply. And if you have something that's less in supply, that typically means it's more expensive. If you are able to hire people and pay more money for it and their productivity justifies it, then that could be a strategy that your organization will pursue. HRM is also involved in downsizing, which is usually when you're letting people go, sometimes through no fault of their own. It's just because the economy is bad and you can't pay for them and you need to gear up to do something else. If you're changing strategies, if there is a product that you're building is no longer relevant, it's obsolete, then the people that you have making those products are no longer necessary. So layoffs can come from these types of reasons. That can be part of downsizing. You can do business process reengineering, which is when you examine all of the jobs that you have and reflect what's going on in the economy, what's going on in the industry, technological changes, maybe things have become more advanced and you need to re-engineer the job to make it reflect the advances in technology. You may also want to outsource certain jobs to be able to control costs. Outsourcing is when you take a portion of what you do and you hire another company to do that for you. If I'm a sole proprietor and I have a smaller company, I've only got 5 or 10 employees, maybe I'll take care of all of the payroll issues myself. That's just going to be another thing that I have to do. If I start to expand, though, and I've got 40, 50 people, it doesn't necessarily make sense for me to hire somebody to do that in-house. It may be cheaper for me to hire a company that does nothing but payroll, and they take care of all of my W-4s and W-2s, and they send out the checks and do the direct deposits. That could be cheaper for me than doing it myself or staffing people. Conversely, if it's a larger company, I've got 10,000, 50,000 employees, it may make more sense for me to have the HR department do all of the payroll myself. So it really depends on the strategy and the state of the company. It may make sense to outsource certain functions. It may make sense to keep it within. It's really a decision that has to be made by the strategic managers of the organization. As we mentioned, downsizing is reducing the workforce. You may have a surplus. You have too many workers to be able to accomplish what you have, so you have to let some of them go. You may be able to put them into different positions because you could have a shortage in one area and a surplus in another. That could require retraining them or reskilling them. When you do a downsize, it can be kind of painful, not only for the people who are getting laid off, but for the people who aren't laid off. If you are working every day with someone and then all of a sudden they don't have a job anymore, the person that you have conversations with is no longer there, that can be upsetting to you. It can also make you wonder if you're next. Am I going to lose my job next? It can also be very challenging for managers. I've been in a position where we've had to lay people off and you have to bring them into the office and let them know that their source of income to pay for their rent, to pay for their food, to put their kids through school, that's no longer going to be available. It's a very difficult situation to be in. So you have to do what you can to keep the morale of the remaining employees and the managers as well to keep it up high enough to be productive. Largely being able to keep the morale up is open communication. You don't want to show up on a Monday morning and find out that half of the employees have been laid off. Keeping people in the loop, letting them know what's coming, how things are going to be decided, that you're going to be giving due process and the policies and processes that you're employing to be able to do the downsizing, that's all important to make sure that people do not lose faith in the company and that they can maintain some level of motivation and satisfaction. The next slide shows job cuts that were announced over the last decade. It starts in 2012. If it went back to, say, 2008, you would have a big spike there as well because that was when the last big recession was. You can see on this chart there was a huge number of reductions in 2020. No surprise, that's the year of the COVID pandemic. And then when the vaccine came out and stores started opening up and organizations started going back to work, the number of layoffs started to reduce again. So you will get these spikes every 5 to 10 years, usually because of a recession or something unusual like a pandemic that might cause that to happen. COVID-19 did cause a lot of layoffs. When organizations shut down, it stopped supply chains. Manufacturers couldn't get the raw materials. If you don't have the raw materials to produce whatever you have and you're paying people to build stuff, they can't really come to work. So there had to be a cessation of work for a little while, or you had to lay people off or just shut down completely. When people came back, it did result in some inflation, and that also included inflation in terms of salaries that were being paid because there has been an increase in salaries as well. An interruption of the supply chain when people need things and they're not being made because the supply went down and the demand stayed the same, or when the pandemic ended and all the stores started opening back up, a lot of that manufacturing hadn't caught up yet to be able to give a supply. So if you didn't have access to the materials that you need and there was still a demand for it, that typically would result in increased prices. So that was one of the aftermaths of the COVID-19 pandemic. There was a lot of emergency legislation that went out. The government did hand out money to companies to be able to help them tide over until the end of the pandemic so that they wouldn't have to lay off quite as many people. I mentioned business process reengineering before. This can be a very intricate and time-consuming process. You basically would look at everything that the organization is doing in terms of all of the work processes to make sure that you're doing it in the most efficient way possible. In Chapter 1, we talked about attaining a competitive advantage. Let's say that you've done it. You're the industry leader. You have a competitive advantage over everybody else. If you just sit on your laurels, you will not have a competitive advantage for long because technology changes, processes changes, your competition is always trying to get better. So even if you achieve a competitive advantage, the idea is to maintain it. And you may need to do a business process reengineering exercise to make sure that all the people in their jobs are doing the work that is required, that the jobs reflect what is needed. And business process reengineering is a big piece of that. So you can go through anything that we're doing. If there have been goals that have changed, you need to update the jobs. You have to look at the design and implement any changes to that design of the jobs so that they will be committed to what's going on. Again, it's very important that you communicate all of this. People don't typically like change, especially if it's thrust upon them. If you can empower your employees and say, look, we need to make sure that we're keeping up with the competition, tell us how we can get better, that can be a big part of the business process reengineering. So instead of telling your employees, hey, surprise, your job has changed, the ideal way is that they are involved with the process all along so that when the changes come, they may not love all of it, but they knew it was coming and they may have had a say in some of the things that are being implemented. So that can make it a much smoother transition and allow the changes that are made to stick. I also kind of talked over the next slide regarding outsourcing. So this is when you do contract certain pieces over to another company. It can give you access to in-depth expertise of someone else. It does cost money, but it may be more efficient. I could probably change the oil in my car. I could do a couple of things in my car, but I have a lot of time that I have to spend on work and other things. If I did it, it would probably take me longer than it would for someone else to do it. It may take me 2-3 hours. I may screw it up. It may take me longer than that to fix it. I may end up having to go to somebody to fix the issue on the car because I screwed it up because I'm not an expert. If I go to an oil change place, they can take care of it in a few minutes and I pay the money for it. And it may cost more than if I did it myself, but the actual value that's provided, because I can be freed up to do other things that can make me money, I don't have to focus on that. I'm not a doctor. I'll go to the doctor and I'll rely on the expertise of the doctor to tell me what's going on to be able to fix whatever issues I have. Same idea here with outsourcing. You can go to someone else who's an expert in a field. I could have an internal legal staff that could be handling all of our lawsuits, or I could go to a law firm. It really depends on the scale of the company. If I'm a big enough company where it makes sense to have an in-house legal team, then I don't have to do outsourcing. But a lot of firms do have a law firm that will be able to support them. You would outsource all of your legal work to them. Whether or not you should outsource, that's really a strategic decision for the company, and it should be based on the things that I was talking about regarding value. The global economy is something that a lot of companies have to address. Even if they're not necessarily exporting or have a presence in other countries, the fact that we have global competition will have an impact on every company that is operating. If you are a domestic company and you're operating locally, you could have competition from outside. So understanding how global markets work could be a benefit to you. Contrast to outsourcing, offshoring is when you move the entire portion of operations of a company to a different country because of potential benefits that you could get economically. My manufacturing in Boston is probably going to cost a lot of money because the standard of living in Boston is quite high. People in Boston will average $60,000, $70,000 a year. If I'm doing manufacturing here, the amount of money that I have to pay my workers is going to be commensurate with the standard of living here. If I could go to another country where the standard of living is lower and the costs are lower, and I only have to pay people $20,000 or $30,000, it may be advantageous for me to move all of my manufacturing capabilities to another country, provided they have the infrastructure and the training necessary to be able to pull it off. Offshoring is when you actually go to a place that is providing you with the best economic advantages. Reshoring is when you actually just bring everything back. It may be that changes over time have made it more expensive where you have offshored to. It could be that you have advantages now because of advances in technology. You may be able to produce things domestically more cheaply. So you may want to bring things back. So that is actually reestablishing operations back where you had started domestically. If you have international offices, you may have workers that would be working domestically. You may want to assign them to go work elsewhere. We have a whole chapter on this that we'll talk about later. But you could have expatriate workers who maybe somebody working in Boston would then go to Germany, or they would go to Australia, or they would go to South Korea. You may have offices there, and it can be beneficial. We talked about training before, and part of training is getting experience. Having the opportunity to go and work in a different environment could really broaden your horizons in terms of how things can and will be done more effectively and efficiently in a company. When a company does pick who's going to go, we'll talk about this in the later chapter, you need to pick people that are going to be more adept and willing to embrace this type of an assignment. It can be beneficial for both parties, both for the company and for the employee, but it can be detrimental if you don't pick the right people to go. If you assign someone to go to another country and they have no interest in going, it's not going to work for either party. If you are going to offshore, you have to look at the workforce and the location where you're going. The workers in the location that you're going, they may be paid less, but they need to be able to perform at the same or at least equal or maybe even better level. So they have to have the ability to use technology. They have to have the ability to understand instructions, to understand the processes that you're using. If you're in manufacturing, you need to go to a country that maybe has less expensive workforces, but you also have to make sure that they have the infrastructure. So if they manufacture something, they have access to ports and airports and other shipping capabilities. They have to have access to the internet. You have to make sure that the infrastructure is there and that the workforce is capable of doing the work, or it really will not give you the advantage that you think it would be. Simply saving money doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get good quality and good value. For international assignments, as I mentioned, you have to pick people who are going to be willing to do it, who are open to these experiences and can benefit from it. The best candidates are the ones who understand the culture of the place that they're going. They understand that they can benefit from it. When they go to the host country, they may have to learn new languages, new skills, and understand how the culture works. So when you're assigning people elsewhere, again, we'll talk about this later, you need to make sure that you're sending the right people. We mentioned the diverse workforce in the United States in Chapter 1. This slide here is basically just showing where the immigrants are coming from in the United States. Asia is about 40%. North America is 32%. That can include Canada and I suppose even Central America. I suppose Mexico is considered North America or Central America. We've got South America is 10%, Africa is 9%, Europe is 8%, and other, which is basically a catch-all for any locations that haven't been identified, is about 1%. Human resources information systems, these are the computer systems that are used by HR to help automate certain processes. Time and attendance is the most obvious one. Where I work, I log into our time and attendance. We call it SSTA. What you do is you put in your time, your manager approves it. I can put in for vacation. All of that gets tracked so my manager can pull up how much vacation time I have, how much I've taken, what my schedules look like. You can also have a learning management system built into it, which is a way to assign training to people. You can have a course. If you're at Northeastern and you're using Canvas, that is partly a learning management system. So when you sign up for courses, you're basically using the same type of system that we're talking about here for a learning management system for a company. By using a computer system to do this, moving away from paper, which really doesn't exist anymore, but I'm old enough to have worked where I had paper timesheets and then people had to take that and put it into a paycheck and track all of that information. It basically cuts out the paperwork and the middleman so that information goes directly into a database that you can then use to mine information from and get information that managers can use to make decisions. It can improve accuracy and efficiency. It can also help you avoid lawsuits because when you follow due process, if you have a computer system that is established where you can't do things unless you check off all the boxes of due process, it can minimize conflicts that could lead to legal action. The information that you get from these systems can also support strategic and day-to-day decision-making, and you can get data for evaluating programs and policies, how well we are doing. It can give you a snapshot in real time about how well a company is performing. Cloud computing is just a way to be able to expand this out. You can sign in and do things on your phone or your laptop from anywhere in the world. And you can set up an intranet as well, as opposed to an internet that anybody can get. If you work for a company, you can log into the intranet. It's basically the internet for the company itself. And you can put in a welcome page. You can have all of the information. You can have an HR page. You can have a marketing page. You can have the time and attendance. All of that is accessible to all of your employees. And it's monitored by the managers and HR. The next slide just shows some of the things that can be done to help automate HR tasks through employee selection, planning, compensation, etc. So please read through that. Because all of this information is being housed in a computer system, in a database, it can then take that information and use analytics with it. So we can have a whole bunch of data. We can find out what the age of our workforce is. Are people getting ready to retire? Do we need to recruit more younger people to be able to backfill the people that are going to be leaving? AI has been a big part of HR to do job analysis, recruiting and selection, performance management, and make sure that you're complying with whatever DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and teamwork that is going on. AI has been useful for recruiting because when people apply for a job, usually they submit an application or a resume. Previously, that was read by a manager. I used to read resumes. Now that is largely a function of a computer that would be looking at the keywords in your resume, and they would be excluding people and including people on the basis of what we have decided is important. That removes the human element from it, which can give an advantage. But if you don't use the right keywords or if you don't design the AI appropriately, you could be excluding people that you would otherwise may want to interview, that you want to consider for a job. So while AI can create a lot of efficiency, it has to be done correctly, or you could be losing some level of efficiency for whatever it is that you're gaining. Because a lot of these are on an intranet and it's accessible after you log in when you get to work in the morning, employees can get access to a lot of the HR information as well through a self-service portal. So this allows you to find out, how much time off do I have in my bank? How much training have I taken? I can get a transcript to show all of the training that I took. Some companies have training requirements. You have to do 5, 10, 25 hours a year. Your LMS can track that for you. And if you're short, you can go sign up for classes to be able to comply with it. Managers can use it for tasks to figure out how compensation is being done. When we talk about payment and compensation and things like comp ratios, determining the proper rate of pay for people, all of that can be done through these computer systems that can aggregate all of this data and create information for you so that you can make decisions on it. The idea between the employee and the employer relationship is essentially a psychological contract. Now, you can have a legitimate contract, which is either verbal or written, where you itemize every single thing, but these are more unspoken, implicit expectations between the employer and the employee. Employees are expected to take responsibility for their careers. They're expected to do the job. Employers are expected to provide perks, proper salary, treat them with respect, etc. in exchange. There has been a decline in union membership. It had been in the 20-30% range back 50, 60, 80 years ago. Since the 1980s, union membership has been declining. Most people who are in unions today either work for government positions, police, fire, etc., or they work for the various trades, plumbers, carpenters, teamsters, etc. There's not a lot of union contracts at a lot of white-collar jobs. However, you may work for a place that does have a union contract. So there are declining union memberships, but you may be in an environment where you have to address it. You may have vendors as well that have unions, and it's not a disadvantage to understand how unions work because you may be exposed to it even if your own business does not involve union employees. One of the things that's different about the modern economy is people tend to have these protean careers, so-called. That means instead of having a job where you get a job out of college and you work for 30, 40 years and then retire, a lot of people tend to go in one job and then they move on to another. Technology changes, maybe your job becomes obsolete, maybe you're not happy with your job, maybe you go back to school, you go to a different career. It's not that unusual for people to go through a half a dozen or more jobs in the course of their career. I was doing an inventory over the last 20, 30 years. I've had a different job about every 3 years. So I'm on my 10th job roughly in about the last 30 years. That doesn't mean that I've left the organization. I've had multiple jobs within the same organization, but I do have different jobs, and I've probably worked for about 5 or 6 different organizations over the same period of time. One of the reasons that I left, and one of the reasons that a lot of people do leave, is because a lot of organizations that they work for do not have a good career path that's established. You have no clear path to be able to get promoted and advance in your job. So if you can't do that where you're working, you may go to another company and take a higher level job that is offered to you there. That's something that should not be slept on if you're working for HR. If you have a good career path and you have training and you're able to promote people from within, that can give them less of an incentive to leave. However, because the way things are working, it's not that unusual for people to go and cycle through different jobs during the course of their career. HR needs to be aware of that. They might be able to mitigate it and reduce the effect of it, but it is a reality that they have to deal with. Flexible staffing levels allows organizations to meet changing needs, especially if you're in an organization that has seasonal work. If you work at a ski resort somewhere in Vermont or in Colorado, you're not going to have the need for employees in July and August as much as you would in January and February. During ski season, you're going to have more employees, so it's important to have the ability to bring in seasonal workers or temporary workers and to be able to adapt and add people. If you work for a tax firm, your tax season is going to be January, February, March, and April because most people pay their taxes in April. You may not need to have that many people working for you the rest of the year. I used to work for the Department of Revenue in Massachusetts, and they do have a large body of people that come in as seasonal workers. They start in November and they leave in May. They come in for tax season, and when we don't have all these tax returns coming in, you don't need that many people. And then we would bring back the same workers. They are happy to do it. A lot of them have already retired. They only work 6 months a year. They take 6 months off. That is the type of flexibility that can be advantageous to both the company and to the employee, because you may not want to work all year long, but you may want to be available to come in when the high season comes along. For the employer, it's obvious what the benefit is. You don't want to have unskilled people coming in when you need them. It's going to take a long time to get them skilled up, but if you have this body of people that you can use on shift work and bring them in as needed, that can help you meet the requirements of the job demands at the time when they are at their peak. Alternative work arrangements also allow flexibility. That can help you attract people that you may not otherwise be able to get. If you have somebody who's a genius in IT design or computing or in marketing, if they can't work a 9-to-5 job, or if they can't work on location, if you're able to give them flexibility in their job, that they can come in earlier in the day and leave earlier, come in later in the day and leave later, or that they can work online, you may be able to hire higher level quality workers that would otherwise not want to work within a very confined or strict regimen of work. If you allow flexibility, you are able to allow people to have jobs that don't interfere with their other requirements of their family or their social work or their social lives. So that can be beneficial for both parties as well. It may be harder to manage because you've got people working at different times. A lot of companies do like to have people physically present. They don't want to do this remote work as much as they did before. It became very popular during and after the pandemic. But if you are able to do that, you could attract people that are better. And we talked about this in Chapter 1. If you get the best employees, you can attain a competitive advantage that you may not otherwise be able to get. So offering flexibility can work as a benefit for both the employer and the employee if it's handled appropriately. If you have a worker shortage, you could have alternative work relationships as well, where you could bring in independent contractors, people who have employment with someone else and you contract with them to come in. You don't necessarily have a contract with the employee themselves. You could have on-call workers, temporary workers, and contract workers. That's very similar to what I was talking about, like we had seasonal workers at the Department of Revenue. The gig economy is something that popped up. Uber is a great example of that. You can work when you want to work. You use the app. That gives you the assignment. I don't know if a lot of people are full-time Uber constantly, but it does give you opportunities to work part-time. And it does give employers opportunities to get these type of people that can work part-time and have a desire for a flexible schedule. So you can both get something out of it. The last thing we want to talk about, again, is the flexible work schedules. If you have the ability to protect people's free time and allow them to have more productively put the work in, you don't necessarily have to have a 9-to-5 job. If you have access to work 24/7, that can result in greater stress, less satisfied employees. So if you do have these flexible work schedules, it's important to make sure that people have downtime. One thing that I discovered when I've been working long enough to see the advent of remote work and cell phones and everything else, it's great because I could work at home, but if I have a 9-to-5 job and I'm working at home and my boss feels like calling me at 8 o'clock at night and then I end up working 12 hours a day instead of 8, that can be a problem. So the advantage of having these flexible work schedules, that's important, but you have to be understanding that you don't want to burn out your employees either. Just because you can reach them 24/7 doesn't mean that it's a good idea that you should. The last few slides here are a summary, so please read through those. We'll move on to Chapter 3 next.